justice, and healthcare systems. While the COVID-19 pandemic revealed the pre-existing fractures and inequalities in our society, it also revealed the inherent interdependency of our lives. We now see more than ever that the health and safety of our society is inextricably connected to the health and well-being of all of us. By facing the structural racial inequities revealed in the pandemic, we can develop and implement creative solutions that will make us a better, healthier, and more just society, not only now, but in the future. As we look at the history of infrastructure investments, we can see how the failure to invest equally in all communities has had durable impacts. Just as one example, while equal employment opportunity is important for economic justice, the ability to travel to and from work is just as critical. And inadequate access to transportation for African Americans has often been caused by discriminatory government action. Historically, eminent domain was used to displace African Americans from residential areas in cities and suburbs to make way for highways and other roadworks. In the rare instances that local governments provided relocation assistance, African Americans were often moved to overcrowded public housing in economically depressed areas with few job prospects, less connectivity to commercial hubs, and where poverty was epidemic. State and local officials and policymakers often cast a blind eye to the impact that these decisions had on the lives of Black people in the United States. Many cities failed to invest in public transportation and failed to create reliable systems in all of their cities. Black communities were thus denied meaningful connection to areas where jobs were most plentiful. Recent government funding for infrastructure and pandemic recovery gives us the opportunity to do things right, to ensure that we all thrive and that America lives up to its promise of equality. Making investment decisions through the lens of racial equity will ensure that we avoid the mistakes of the past. So thank you, Secretary Julian Castro, TMI Senior Research Fellow, for hosting this exceptional panel discussion. I will turn it over to LDF's Director of Policy, Lisa Kyler Barrett, who will introduce Julian Castro. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janae. It is truly a pleasure to join for this important conversation and to introduce our moderator for today's discussion. Julian Castro is currently serving as a non-resident senior research fellow with the Thurgood Marshall Institute at the Legal Defense Fund, where he collaborates with LDF staff on projects relating to boosting economic mobility and quality of life for communities of color. Secretary Castro's experience as a city council member and mayor of San Antonio, Texas, provide him with a valuable perspective on issues related to the needs, challenges, and barriers of local communities accessing and benefiting from federal investments. In addition to his local government experience, Secretary Castro served as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development under President Obama, where he led important efforts related to fair housing, including the release of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Regulation, which advocates and local jurisdictions had urged HUD to issue for decades. Secretary Castro's experience at the federal level provides invaluable insight into the relationship of the federal government with cities, counties, and states in the administration of federal investments, including infrastructure. Today's conversation about how to ensure equity in the investment of federal infrastructure and pandemic relief funds is timely and much needed as we all work to ensure that the communities with the highest needs are able to benefit from these critical investments. Secretary Castro, we are grateful for your involvement and insights in producing this webinar and truly look forward to meeting the panel. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for the introduction, but more importantly, thank you for the fantastic work that you do as part of LDF. I also want to, of course, thank Janae Nelson. It's an exciting time at LDF under her new leadership, and I appreciate her remarks at the beginning of this webinar. It's also a great honor for me to serve this year in 2022 as a Senior Research Fellow at the LDF Thurgood Marshall Institute because of the wonderful and impactful work that TMI does on a whole host of issues, including what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Doing Things Right, Ensuring Vulnerable Communities Benefit from Pandemic-Era Federal Investment. If you think about the last couple of years for local communities, for cities, it has been such a roller coaster ride. You think about the enormous public health crisis, and our local communities are where the rubber meets the road in terms of public health and all sorts of outreach for vaccinations and everything associated with trying to make sure that people are well and well taken care of. You think about the way that local communities were impacted in terms of their tax revenues during these last 2 years and their ability to meet their budgets, the way that schools in local communities were affected, and maybe most importantly, the fact that the most vulnerable people in our country were the hardest hit by the pandemic over the last 2 years, and that local communities have been at the forefront, not only of dealing with the pandemic and the recession that came with it, but also after the murder of George Floyd, grappling with how to ensure that there's accountability and true justice at the local level. And more recently, grappling with things like anti-democratic attacks. So today, we're going to focus on one part of that roller coaster ride, which is where cities find themselves today. If you think about it, there are investments being made in local communities that we haven't seen in more than a generation. CARES Act dollars, American Rescue Plan dollars, bipartisan infrastructure plan dollars, and perhaps in the future, pieces of what the Biden administration has called Build Back Better. That's still to come, we'll see, but already billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars are flowing into local communities. And so they have some important and enormous decisions to make about how to invest those dollars. Today's webinar brings together a group of panelists that have an amazing perspective to offer, hopefully for the benefit of other local elected officials and advocates, on how local communities can do things right by the most vulnerable people in their jurisdiction. Too oftentimes, certain neighborhoods, certain residents get left behind. Oftentimes, those are communities of color. They're low-income communities. Race, geography, income play an intimate role in the distribution of resources. We're going to have the opportunity today to focus on how we can do things differently and get these investments to the people who need them the most. I'm excited to welcome this group of panelists, and I want to introduce them to you just briefly, starting with Mayor Chokwe Antar Lumumba. He was elected the 53rd mayor of Jackson, Mississippi in 2017 and re-elected in 2021 with nearly 70% of the vote. He has won a lot of plaudits for a whole number of initiatives. Some of them he's going to talk about today. And he's brought a progressive vision to the city. I also want to welcome Cristania De Leon, who is the co-executive director of the Participatory Budgeting Project. She's held executive roles in that organization since 2019, and she's based out of Oakland. Her career has been focused on looking at the social determinants of health and justice. I also want to welcome Leo Flora, who is the director of the King County, Washington Department of Community and Health Services. This is a position that he's held for 3.5 years, and he's been with the King County for more than 6 years. In his current role, he oversees a biennial budget of more than $2 billion. And then finally, last but certainly not least, and a familiar face to me, is Gustavo Velazquez. Gustavo currently is in Sacramento, where he's serving as the director of the Department of Housing and Community Development for the state of California under the administration of Governor Gavin Newsom. Previously, he and I had the opportunity to work together when he served as the Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the Department of Housing and Urban Development from 2014 until early 2017 under the Obama administration. And I want to say thank you, a big gracias to all of our panelists, to welcome you. And I know that each of you has a perspective on the challenge that local communities face. And we're hoping that there are some local elected officials, policymakers, and also advocates to get to watch today's webinar who are wondering, they see the opportunity out there. They know that all of these dollars are flowing into their community, and they both have a heart and a mind for trying to do something differently to make sure that the most vulnerable get the resources they need. We're going to get into some of the specifics about what's happening in your own areas. But first, I just wanted to start by asking each of you to maybe take 2 minutes to give an overall reflection on the challenge that we're talking about and also the opportunity. And I'll start with you, Mayor Lumumba.
Greetings to everyone. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my friend, Secretary Castro, for not only moderating this discussion and doing an amazing job framing the conversation, but I'm also certainly honored to be a part of such a well-informed group of panelists. I think that when we look at the effects of this pandemic, what we ultimately realize is that COVID-19 did not come in order to discriminate against any particular community. However, it certainly highlighted the fragility of our communities. It highlighted where inequities have existed for quite some time. And so it also highlighted that our lack of investment is not so much on account of the lack of resources, for we live in a world of abundance, but we operate from a place of scarcity. Our failure to do so more or less reflects the lack of political will in order to address the most vulnerable communities. And so as we talked about the myriad of things in the framing of this conversation, what we see ultimately are communities that are suffering from cycles of humiliation, whether it's failing infrastructure, high poverty, poor performing schools, and the list goes on and on and on. And so I think that our mission, whether it's through the utilization of federal dollars or programmatic solutions that are much longer standing, is how do we reveal a dignity economy, one which reflects the inherent dignity that everyone deserves. And if we're going to do that, if we're going to truly have a mission of revealing a new economy, it has to be done with the surplus of people who have been cast away by the present one. So I'm happy to be a part of this conversation and get into the nuts and bolts of what this looks like. One last statement, Secretary Castro, I certainly appreciate your vast experience, not only serving on the federal level, but really being on the grassroots level of what it means, what is the efficacy of the investment of federal dollars when it truly serves the community in your role as mayor. So happy to join this discussion, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mayor Lumumba. And of course, I know we both know that a mayor's work is never done. So I want to ask now Cristania De Leon of the Participatory Budgeting Project to give your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to honor the gratitudes offered earlier for having us here today, and excited to talk about the work of the Participatory Budgeting Project, our incredible network of partners. So the Participatory Budgeting Project has been working since 2009 with communities to learn about, advocate for, and implement participatory practices, primarily around participatory budgeting. And so for folks who may be unfamiliar, participatory budgeting is a process where community members directly decide together how to spend portions of our public budgets. It includes phases where we convene community to design the approach and the rules of a process for a very particular space and community. We surface fundable ideas and priorities from community members through community-wide idea collection. We develop concrete proposals through research and create highly vetted, specific projects that can be funded. We have a broad and inclusive community vote that's followed by the funding and implementation of winning projects. So I came to this work because it's a very different way of engaging community members, and specifically our vulnerable community members, in direct decisions that most affect their day-to-day lives. And for me, as a Black Latinx woman raised by immigrants in a family that represents community members most left out of decision-making, I know what a difference that can make. And we've been seeing more and more communities and community leaders really acknowledge the importance and the power of community-led decision-making in seeking forward a recovery and defining what recovery looks like and who it's for, who it's intended to benefit, and how we back that up with infrastructure, budgets, real power in the hands of community members to make that happen. So we've been really excited to see the expansion of interest in participatory practice, particularly as we're recognizing the incredible exasperation of longstanding inequities in communities, and really pursuing opportunities to explore what that really looks like to put decision-making in the hands of those community members. So we've seen incredible strides. Our team works in coalition with a lot of other local and national partners through a Democracy Beyond Elections coalition that's been pushing for community-led decision-making between and beyond elections, and it absolutely includes running a collaborative campaign to advocate for a community-led recovery. That's really focused on the allocation of recovery funds, American Rescue Plan Act funds, and other federal funds that are going to be pushed into communities, and really seeing how they can be allocated through processes like participatory budgeting in schools, in municipalities all over the country. So we're really excited to see this expansion, the focus on equity within the growth of this work, and are really excited to be here to learn together, to share more, and see what this can look like in the context of a just and equitable recovery for all of our communities.
And I'm looking forward to hearing a lot more about how participatory budgeting works when we delve into some of the specifics, because I think that this is one great example of practical change that local elected officials and policymakers could make to get a more equitable distribution of resources. Next, I want to go to Gustavo Velazquez. You have a bit of a different perspective serving at the state level these days. Some of us are in states that are in harmony with big cities and local communities, and others are not. California certainly is one where you would expect a lot of cooperation, but just give us your reflection, Gustavo.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Secretary, for this opportunity to be with you all. Let me first start by categorically admitting that housing is infrastructure. And I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say that. Housing creation is part of the engine of economic recovery. It creates jobs. It spurs new communities, hopefully inclusive communities with prosperity. And housing is the foundation for access to opportunity. If you think about it, everything in someone's lives revolves around the place we call home, whether it's proximity to and quality of jobs, safety in the streets, access to education, clean air and clean water, healthy food. So we are doomed, really screwed, pardon my language, if we don't use the equity lens, equitable outcomes, when we are planning, when we're using taxpayer dollars, and when we are implementing programs that create and retain quality, safe, and affordable housing in an equitable manner. In California, we are hard at work every day trying to get our state out of an escalating housing crisis and homelessness crisis, #1 in the country for both, that has been decades in the making. Just a couple things to give you a better idea of what we're currently facing. California's housing supply has been persistently well behind need, and housing and rental costs are out of control. A global pandemic has certainly not helped matters. These are problems that stab at the livelihood of ordinary Californians trying to find affordable housing and juggling to pay for a roof over their heads or meet other basic needs. And that disproportionately affects people of color. These issues are certainly not unique to California, but because of the scale of the size of the population, the diversity of population, largest state in the nation, certainly prominent here in the state. If these things are left unchecked, this is a crisis that over time will sap the strength, vitality, inclusiveness of our communities and our economy. But as I talk to you right now, we know with coordination amongst all parties, the stakeholders, increased state, federal collaboration, local collaboration, we're doing the work of, start turning the tide and provide more opportunity for our state's most vulnerable residents. Secretary, you made this point a lot, that housing is the foundation for everything else in life. Decent housing can be a path out of poverty. It's the first source of safety and stability. And unfortunately, California, again, leads the nation in poverty, 12.8% of California in poverty. When you adjust that to housing cost and transportation costs, we're closer to 20% poverty. It's per se that the top 5 most common occupations in California pay less than the wage needed to afford housing. So, of course, that compounds the situation when you look at homelessness, continues to be a vexing challenge for us here in California. We are about 12-13% of the country's population, but 1/5 of the homelessness population in the country. So I look forward to the conversation to further explain what we are doing with the use of these federal investments in an equitable fashion, and also learning from all of you about what you're doing in your respective roles.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. And you certainly have a gargantuan task, as you noted there, in terms of meeting the housing needs of Californians, and particularly coming out of the pandemic. And one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit later is how do we ensure that states are able to work in concert with local communities, cities and counties better, and with the federal government to address that issue and other distribution of resources. Now I want to go to Leo Flora, who is the Director of Housing and Human Services for, I want to make sure I'm getting that right, Department of Community and Human Services for King County. Now, King County is a huge county out there that includes the Seattle area, I think one of the biggest counties in the Pacific Northwest. And so you have quite a perch there to all of these challenges. Give us your thoughts, your opening reflections.
Absolutely. Well, first, it's always wonderful when you are inspired by the people that you get to share a Zoom screen with, and that's to a person the case here. The other thing, just first, it's particularly an honor to participate in this conversation under the umbrella of the Thurgood Marshall Institute, as we talk about what it looks like to take structures that have been used historically to oppress or deprive people of opportunity, and to use those structures to transform themselves in ways that are pro-equity, that are undoing those oppressions and those inequitable distributions of benefit and burden. The other opening thing that I think it's super important to be clear about is what we do with the resources afforded us now will either set us on a course towards undoing and mitigating the inequitable structures that we see, or we will perpetuate it. And so we have this real sort of urgency of the moment in the context of what has been a centuries-long trend of favoring some people in our nation, in our communities, and disfavoring others. So I'm really excited as we get into some of the mechanics of what it looks like to take something as seemingly simple as a contract and then multiply that by the hundreds of millions of dollars that are flowing into jurisdictions right now, and take those seemingly simple mechanisms like contracts and use them to undo inequity, to use them in ways that can support communities of color. So that's one real opportunity. And another one that I hope we get to talk about, and it's really cool to see Christiana on the call, is an increasing, I think, recognition of the symbiosis that we should be seeking between government and what some folks will call activists or organizers. But there's this real symbiosis that's possible where these don't have to be oppositional forces in a bad way, but can be oppositional forces in a productive way. And so that's another thing that I'm really interested in learning from my fellow panelists on today is I think the future involves us recognizing the value of community and organizers in particular, and how that can work with government. Human services can and should be the field of undoing and mitigating inequity in our communities. That's why I'm happy to do this work, and that's why I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel.
All right. Thank you, Leo, and we look forward to hearing more about your experience there in King County. Mayor, I want to ask you, as we go through a little bit of the common stumbling blocks to the equitable distribution of resources. All of us know that it happens. It's happened forever. Of course, all of this goes on against the backdrop of historic inequities from the federal government down to the local level, from redlining all the way down to discriminatory policies in cities that have shaped where people live, who lives there, have baked in the effects of racism and have disadvantaged many folks over the generations. You were elected in 2017, and so you've been mayor for about 5 years now. You can't turn the world upside down in 5 years. And at the same time, you brought a progressive vision to the city and you wanted to make change. What gets just from the perspective of a mayor, what is difficult about reorienting how you distribute resources in a community to get to so many of those Black neighborhoods, those communities of color, those low-income neighborhoods that are often left behind?
Well, I thank you for that question, and I think that that my fellow panelists framed it correctly. That we have to be intentional in this effort to make certain that equity is central to our efforts now, or we could further exacerbate those inequities that are there. And what makes it difficult is the fact that historically that has not been the charge, that has not been the effort to lift up equity in this process. And so we continue to perpetuate the same systems and the same investments, leaving people in the wake of that. One example that I think underscores this challenge most of all for the city of Jackson is, the troubles that we have experienced with our infrastructure as it relates to our water distribution. And there are communities within the city of Jackson that are disproportionately affected by the failure and the age and the challenges with that water distribution system. Just by way of background, our water treatment facility operates off of hydraulics and PSA, pounds per square inch, where we push water to the furthest points of our city and the highest elevations. Now, what we have experienced is the communities that have the most dense Black and brown representation and the highest levels of poverty are the ones that have suffered the greatest or most disproportionately at the hands of not being able to consistently depend on our water supply. Now, for those residents, they certainly recognize the inequities of certain communities that don't have the challenges as severely as they do. Now, it does not manifest in the form of, at the water treatment facility, we have a lever that distributes water to Northeast Jackson or South Jackson. But it is indicative of the fact that city planning is never neutral, right? And so when the decision was made where we would put our water treatment facility or other resources, a premium was assigned to the properties where the resources were closest. And the communities that are furthest away, the property values are lower. And typically we find people that suffer at the hands of poverty in those communities most extremely. And so, we not only have the mission now, as we are looking at this challenge and looking at federal funds, of creating a sustainable, dependable system, but also lifting up equity as a charge and a concern in that matter. And that's a different lens than I think that we historically have looked at it. I think we also have to recognize, while we are grateful for the federal resources, that state preemption, states' rights are very real matters. In Mississippi, while we certainly are applauding and celebrating the distribution of federal funds, we certainly have the concern right here in Jackson, Mississippi, as to whether we will ever receive those funds in a proportionate way to the challenges that we have, and a fair representation of the portion we represent of the state's challenges. And so I think that it is incumbent upon those that still retain power, whether it's through the approval of state utilization plans, to make certain that the plans that our states are incorporating certainly lift up communities that have suffered at the hands of environmental justice, suffered at the hands of failing infrastructure disproportionately. And so this is important to the discussion, I believe.
Thank you for that. And Leo, I want to ask you, I mean, from the perspective of being there in King County, again, a large county, what do you see in terms of the common stumbling blocks, the challenges to the equitable distribution of resources? What do you see most commonly?
Absolutely. Fortunately, I think that this is becoming less common, but it still exists. Sometimes it's as basic as getting people to agree upon the premise that there is inequity, that inequity is primarily driven by a person's race and ethnicity, and that is bad. Increasingly, and I'm really proud in King County, that's not really an argument that we have to have anymore. And I want to recognize that that's not necessarily true, that consensus exists everywhere. I think another thing that is really potentially difficult in a county like King County, as you mentioned, about 2.3 million people. In moments of pride, we might say, more people in this county than in 15 of the US states. We have a lot of diversity, but we have a lot of concentration. And in a system of government that is geographically organized in terms of its representation, there often is a tension between geographic distribution versus distribution relative to the presence of need or oppression or historic underinvestment. So that's a second tension. And then I think a third thing is the government can sometimes get a little too proud of itself about a one-time investment. And it is possible to actually help in the moment and harm in the long term if the nature of our investments are ones that will, we want these outcomes, but among those outcomes are not the long-term sustainability of the organizations that are community-based, that does not support equitable wages for folks of color who might primarily doing this work. And so, and that's a thing where, as a funding entity, we are not perfect on that. We see the problem, we seek to get better, but I think one of the real themes as we talk about what is the ability to absorb large amounts of federal funding, even when it's well-intended, is what is the ability of a workforce to actually sustainably implement that in a way where the result 10 years from now is that those organizations are healthier instead of having been burned out or run through by the process.
Cristania, I want to delve into the sort of mechanics of what participatory budgeting is in a few moments. But first, just a quick focus on, y'all get the calls of communities that are interested in doing budgeting differently. And obviously something is motivating them to go in that direction. What are the common reasons they cite? What are the pitfalls that they've seen with doing things the traditional way?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think folks come with an interest for this work because they crave something different. And I think it recognizes that there are a lot of various challenges at play. There are certainly challenges that can be very specific to communities, but there are very broad, more common and systemic issues that really come up a lot. And when we think about our approach to this work, we do center a couple of key principles that relate specifically to some really big challenges that specifically address that budget allocation, resource allocation typically is not equitable, typically is not accessible, and typically doesn't feel significant for community leadership. And so when we talk about what does it mean to make this work equitable, I think that's been touched on a couple of times and spoken to really well. And I think is really exacerbated in doing work in this COVID era, because we have to think about who's the most impacted by inequity prior to COVID era investments and during. And I think that requires us to really approach this work in a way that addresses not just acknowledging that inequities exist, but really getting to the root cause of these inequities and not being afraid to name or offer a commitment to really address things like white supremacy. Let's name it. Let's talk through it. Community wants to see that. And they're really interested in saying, how do we actually confront these systems directly? How do we acknowledge the benefit of community expertise in leading in the creation of solutions and pathways forward? And so one common stumbling block and one common challenge or theme is how we actually define equity. And if when we do that, if we're really getting to the root of it, and if we're willing to take the steps to dismantle those inequities across our institutions and community spaces alike. Another challenge that comes up is in recognizing how inaccessible our budget processes can be, our resource allocation processes, decision-making, policy work. And I think that, in the question earlier, Secretary Castro, you kind of named a couple of things around, the role of race and income and geography. Accessibility to this work will really differ greatly depending on one's experience of all of those factors and a myriad of others. And so, equitable spending, equitable work, and a lot of what people are really striving to do when they want to kind of pivot and do something differently really does rely on ensuring community members who face the greatest barriers to participation, who find this work deeply inaccessible, to see how they're able to guide the ways that we approach this work as well. And I think PB offers that, but a myriad of other approaches do as well. And it really does push us to offer intention around how we engage transparently in this work. Are we willing to open up how our budget process works? Are we willing to share data and information? Are we willing to build the trust that it takes and understanding that's required to ensure this work is accessible as defined by community leadership, community membership? And that relies on doing this upfront and doing it early, and even before you may get to a PB process, really thinking about, are we considering accessibility in this work to really surface community needs and address them, proactively and intentionally. And the last thing I mentioned was around significance. Is community engagement, community voice really significant, or are the outcomes of our resource allocation significant to community members? And so when we talk about equity, we also talk a lot about power and recognizing that decision-making is very often concentrated in the hands of folks who do benefit from unequal power dynamics. And so we really recognize, if we don't put power into the hands of community or work more continuously in partnership with community leadership, we do run the risk of continuing the cycles of inequity. And we recognize the role of a breadth of expertise to really disrupt this and commit to building the trust that it takes to do that. And really saying, if we're going to involve y'all in this process, it's going to be worth your time, it's going to matter, and we're going to honor the decisions that you make. So a lot of things that folks come forward that kind of surface an interest in some of this work are really rooted in like frustrations or tensions around how those three factors kind of move together and play. And I will say, I think the benefit of doing participatory work is that we kind of get to see some of those silver linings as well, some of the silver linings around addressing these stumbling blocks in recognizing that all of the answers, the expertise, the capacity that we need to create more equitable distribution of resources, they exist all around us. It just takes kind of the time and the willingness to shift some of that power dynamics to really invite that in and work more collaboratively towards outcomes that I think benefit all of us in the long run.
Thank you for that. And you look forward to our conversation in a few moments about some of these examples of participatory budgeting. Just finally on this topic of the common problems, the stumbling blocks, Gustavo, you spoke a lot a few moments ago about housing. And unfortunately, one of the stumbling blocks at the local level is NIMBYism. and zoning, land use restriction laws that have made it difficult to create more affordable housing opportunity. In California, you have this back and forth between YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard, and NIMBYs. That's well beyond our conversation today. But I guess from your perspective at the state level, talk to me about what you've seen more recently in the state that has made it difficult to create more opportunity and to do it equitably.
You're right. I love to spend my answer here really pinning down the issue of homelessness, partially because the state received, billions of dollars in CARES Act funding to address the public health emergency. And homelessness, as I mentioned earlier, we are 13% of the population in the country, but more than 25% the homelessness population nationwide. And homelessness is another area where there is overrepresentation of people by race and ethnicity. Native Americans are overly represented in the homelessness community. African Americans, just to give you an example, in LA is largest city in the state. It's about 8%, 8.1% African American population, but more than 25% the homelessness population is African American. And it boils down to housing shortage, right? It's the main problem. The research is conclusive. The evidence is conclusive that it is, first and foremost, lack of housing what has made the problem of homelessness so big. We are a first housing state, a first housing model state, where you don't need to prove that you are part of a program to obtain a key to a home. You should first obtain access to a home and then deal with other issues. And I say that because there's a stigma, right, associated with homeless persons being just people under addiction or severe mental health. And that is just not true. It's a portion of the homelessness population, but it is not the entire problem of homelessness. And so this area, we have a strong local, state, and federal partnerships. When COVID started escalating, we used a model called Room Key to move immediately, thousands of homeless persons to non-congregate settings to, avoid greater risk.
I'm not sure if we lost Gustavo. His video may have gotten frozen there. Hopefully we'll get him back in a second. But in the meantime, let's get into the heart of this conversation, which I think that folks who are watching are going to find the most helpful. We want to talk about getting it right. We want to talk about doing things differently and getting an equitable distribution of resources. And let me start with you, Cristania. Talk to me about how participatory budgeting works, just mechanically, and what is the ultimate outcome of that?
Yeah, so one thing I will acknowledge when we talk about the framework of participatory budgeting is that it mostly should be conceived as just that. It is a framework and needs to be adapted for the very particular needs of a specific community. So you see a lot of variance in processes because no two communities are alike, so no two processes are quite alike. But within the framework itself, there are typically a couple of key stages of deliberative decision-making that centers collaboration, transparency, and community leadership at its core. Typically, a participatory budgeting process would kick off once we know the pot of funds that we're allocating. So we talk about large sums of federal funds coming into community spaces. It's a prime opportunity to really think about what could this potentially offer, and where are we intending to see these funds benefit our community members? Where will they most be impacted? Where can they most seek to benefit? And once we allocate a portion of that budget, which is hopefully, again, significant to community members, we really dive into seeing the mechanics kind of play out. And the first thing that we do is we convene community leaders. We convene a representative committee of community members that oftentimes over-represents with equity considerations to come together and really design the approach of this framework within their specific community. So they will come together and they'll think about, what is our outreach mechanism here? Should there be any kind of considerations for an age requirement to participate in this work? Do we want to focus on particular neighborhoods or areas within our municipality or district to really put this work forward? That design process builds an equity at the front and is directly led by community members. Then we run it up. It goes to community who are coming together to really think about what these funds can be applied for, what we can spend with this funding. And they have an opportunity to think really practically, but also really dream and really identify the fundable ideas and priorities that they have on behalf of their own community. So it might be the case where we say, this is very particular applications, but within this broader realm of potentially, maybe it's housing, maybe it's infrastructure, maybe it's unrestricted. What are those needs that you have and how can they start to meet those needs? We might get thousands of ideas that surface from community. We then work with a sort of group of community members to then take all those ideas, we kind of synthesize them, we prioritize them, and we whittle them down into a sort of select prioritized number of ideas that then get developed into concrete proposals. Tons and tons, and I will say this is typically at a city level, months, research, vetting, feasibility assessment. But what they do is they come together and they work with government infrastructure or other experts in community to really consider community need, funding feasibility, and equitable impact of these particular projects. These projects then move on to a ballot. The full community, again, is able to vote for the projects that they want to see funded. And then those that are win kind of the top vote, they're funded. They're funded in community. They're implemented, could be over a shorter period of time or a longer period of time, depending on the project. But it is direct decision-making in the hands of community members. And so, when we think about like the impacts or potential of this work, well, I meant that most of the work can look different based on where you're doing it. What we really do see across the board is strong consideration of how participatory budgeting can allow community members to address needs that have maybe long been deprioritized or long been unmet, and particularly now have been exacerbated. And so it's a really key opportunity. And I think cities that have done this for a long time will say there are things we funded through participatory budgeting that are absolutely essential and really favorable and really well used that otherwise we never would have been able to see come into play. And it opens up possibilities for that kind of impact in community spaces. And because community designs the rules, often folks who are excluded from civic participation or other kind of decision making, or even spaces like voting, as we conceive of that in more traditional spaces, that includes folks who are undocumented, people who are currently or formerly incarcerated, young people, our elders, they're all able to mobilize and fully participate in a process like participatory budgeting. So the impacts are really broad and they're really deeply felt by community members who are most commonly impacted by budget decisions, but not always able to inform how those decisions can affect them and really center equity in that process. And what I will say is that as a framework, participatory budgeting won't guarantee that it's transparent and equitable and all the things. We've got to really bring a particular lens to this framework and work with community to do that, to set that at the outset. And when that's done, these impacts are really maximized and really prominent throughout a lot of spaces that are practicing participatory budgeting, both in the US, but globally as well.
Absolutely. Just a quick follow-up question. For those communities that are intrigued by participatory budgeting, what are some of the communities that have already used it? And also, is this something that can be scaled up for the budgeting process, or is it mostly for special projects where you have discretionary funds and so forth?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is if you can spend a budget, you can do participatory budgeting with it. Communities of all sizes, and I'll say even from folks within their nonprofit organizations, do participatory budgeting. We've seen government spaces internally practice this as well. We practice this as an organization, but we've seen a range of spaces from small rural communities and cities to larger cities, counties, a lot of conversation about how this can look at state levels and really looking at federal support as well in growing this work. It's incredibly scalable. And so you'll see practice in participatory budgeting all over the US in cities that are really long standing and kind of large. So areas like New York City and Boston and Chicago, they've done this work kind of for a long time in larger metros, but also areas that are smaller and rural. And we've seen a lot of interest in looking at American Rescue Plan Act funds, infrastructure funds, preparing for federal influxes of funding, particularly in areas that have not seen this level of investment before. So in smaller rural communities, there's been a huge push and a huge interest in participatory budgeting as well, because of its ability to work across different funding streams and spaces. But what I will say is that across the board, if you're considering participatory budgeting, we really do encourage folks to think about it not as something that you might do on the side, something you might do when conditions are perfect, we have surplus, everything's great, we're waiting for new federal funds to come in, but really is a new way of doing business, and really is a way to kind of consider, how do you make the decisions you already have to make better and more impactfully. And so you'll see a diversity of interests across the US and globally around this work at all scales and levels. And as it scales up, it also affords opportunities for folks within government, be it within singular spaces, so across city departments that typically don't working together to work on these proposals, for example, or an outreach, but also looking at, in cases like LA, we have county staff who are working with city staff to help them implement their work, because they can support each other in navigating bureaucracy. As it scales up, how then do we offer, maybe at a city level or a county level, guidance around participatory budgeting statewide? How then at our states do we offer guidance around federal releases of infrastructure funds or other kinds of funds, and guidance on how to spend it federally? And so the scale of it's also supporting communities and jurisdictions to actually work together to figure out how they can collaborate differently and do this work differently long term.
Wonderful. Mayor, you are dealing with these issues right now in Jackson. You mentioned your experience with the water distribution system and trying to introduce a more equitable approach there. What are some other examples of some of the ways that y'all are thinking and then acting differently with either these federal funds or other funds that you've received to ensure a better equitable distribution of resources?
Well, I thank you for that question, because it allows me to tag along to Christiana's most recent statements. The city of Jackson, even prior to COVID, we have, entered into the foray of trying to include participatory budgeting processes. Now, I will admit that we are still, in my opinion, at an infancy phase in that, and have, even lost a little momentum during COVID because of the communication barriers of people having to socially distance. But as we look at the lens of equity, there are a few things that I would say. One, we should see city budgets as moral documents, documents which should reflect the values we have as a community, and we should fund those values that the community has. And if the community has no participation, if they have no say-so in that, then we can't suggest that we are actually funding those values, and quite often maybe scratching where people aren't itching. But also in that process, what we're trying to lift up is economic opportunities. I live in a city which is about 85% Black, and so I'm unapologetic about supporting Black business. My position is, if 85% of your population is left-handed, then you need some left-handed jobs. But even that, in and of itself, isn't sufficient to address the lack in communities. And so what we have seen in our city is investments. We've seen enterprise that has done well, but may not have expressed the reciprocal relationship of investing back in the community. They may have done well, but they may have searched for greener pastures and left the very communities that gave rise to it. And so we're even looking at things like creating incubator funds for cooperative business models, stealing from the wisdom of people like Fannie Lou Hamer, because the question of how poor people bring their resources together to solve problems is not an original question. So as Fannie Lou was able to organize poor Mississippi farmers in the Mississippi Delta, how do we broaden that notion and broaden that idea in order to fill our gaps as a community? So not only is the mission creating enterprise and creating opportunities for people, but we can also look at worker-owned cooperatives where people can not only decide how their labor, but what the fruits of their labor will be, which helps us address many of the gaps within our community. When we look at these different models and different approaches as cities, we have to accept the reticence and the resistance of shifting our funding models. And the reality is that most people are not afraid of change. Most people are afraid of loss. And so we have to be able to frame the narrative around how these decisions are aimed at our collective gain. And when we have witnessed the fragility of our communities, which have given rise to more issues of public safety within our community, we have to be able to connect these dots so that every community understands how it is these decisions are for their collective gain.
Absolutely. And Leo, talking about King County's experience, what are you all doing to approach the equitable distribution of resources in new ways? What kind of success are you having? What are you most proud of there?
Absolutely. Well, first, just a quick second person to echo enthusiasm for what Cristania is talking about. I think that's some of the most exciting work that we'll hear about today. And I'm struck by the notion that I don't think the notion of participatory budgeting is actually controversial. I think where it's controversial, people are usually reacting to who gets to participate. But we've got well-worn paths in our country that some people get to participate in budgeting, just not others. And so that really jumped out to me as Cristania was talking. So here in King County, what I want to talk about specifically now, one program that we've really been working hard on is what we call our Eviction Prevention and Rental Assistance Program at the federal level. It's got several different names depending on the fund source. So basically, the federal government has identified billions of dollars, put those out across the country for the purpose of allowing people affected by COVID to pay their rent and to forestall or prevent evictions. And evictions, come with any number of terrible, long-lasting consequences. One of the most severe of which is what Gustavo was talking about with homelessness. And King County is another community where we have a disproportionate amount of homelessness. As we took a look at the eviction prevention program, we recognized up front, because of the research of a lot of good community organizations, and the Thurgood Marshall Institute actually has recently done research on this as well, that the way evictions happen are expressions of structural racism in our country, and that's certainly the case in King County. A disproportionate number of people who are evicted from their homes identify as being Black or African American, and also Native American in King County. And so at the outset, one of the sort of challenges we had to face is how can you put a historic amount of money out as quickly as possible in a way that will break the pattern of who gets evicted and who doesn't, as opposed to perpetuating that pattern. And I'm not here to say that we got it perfect, but I do think we stumbled onto and created a couple mechanisms that I'm excited to share. So one is seemingly basic. This idea of fairness is a really interesting one when we talk about access to government programs and government resources. And one of the, I think, purest forms of this notion of fairness is first come, first serve. If you set up a rent assistance program that is first come, first serve among tenants, that feels fair to a lot of people. We also realized that that was likely going to exacerbate and perpetuate patterns of racial disproportionality in who was going to get funding and who was not going to get funding. So although controversial at the time, and it took some persuasion and I think some courage from elected leaders like my boss, our county executive, Dow Constantine, it was, we're not going to do first come, first serve. Mm-hmm. We're going to create a lottery system under the hypothesis that we might get less pronounced racial disproportionality. The next thing we did is we got to work with community-based organizations who have existing relationships with the communities that we know are most likely to be evicted. So I spoke earlier about the sort of power of this dull thing called the contract. Who do we contract with? Which organizations do we contract with? How do we centralize at the county level as much of the burden of administering federal funds? And federal funds are some of the hardest types of funds to administer. How do we centralize that burden, but then push out into the community and those community-based organizations the ability to deploy that funding in a way that lets them use existing relationships with the community? A third thing is language access. We translated all of the materials in our eviction prevention program in 29 languages. That is more than like the requirement for the top six languages that we have in some of our local ordinances. But we recognized again that the accessibility of the information was going to be really important, and that combined with a more neutral process like a lottery could actually reverse these data that we were expecting to see. And then data is the last thing here. Is you cannot measure the equitable impact of investment of funding by your intent at the beginning of the process. You have to understand who actually gets help, the sort of durability of that help, and data is a really important way to do that. And so at the end of it, we have here in King County, 6 to 7% of our county's population identifies as Black or African American. As I discussed before, Black or African American residents of our county make up a hugely disproportionate number of the folks who get evicted. They make up about 25 to 40% of our homeless population, depending on the metric that you use. And when we took a look at this distribution of what became hundreds of millions of dollars, I'm proud to say that 75% of the recipients of rental assistance in King County, Washington, had a head of household who identified as a person of color. And within that, really close to 40% of those heads of household identified as Black or African American. And so we did not undo centuries of systemic racism with one program in 2 years, but I think we got a glimpse into what it can look like to use policies, contracts, and a little bit of deliberate design, all animated by values, and then measuring the results. And it's actually something that I'm really proud of. And now we've just got to sustain that long term so that the organizations that did the outreach are sustainable, and the people who stayed in their homes, don't just run into the same problem 6 months from now.
And let me just ask you a quick follow-up question to that. I mean, how are you going to measure success?
I think the ultimate measure of success when you take a look at an eviction prevention program is who got the money immediately, but we are tracking evictions in the courts now to see who gets evicted over the next 12 months. Because part of the success here, again, has to be durable. I think one of our biggest risks in equitably distributing funding is that we sort of get self-satisfied with a momentary success or win or progress, and it blinds us to the fact that, if you do something for 2 years inside of a multi-century system of systemic oppression, you're not really doing anything. We need to string together decades of pro-equity policy to undo the forces that have sort of gotten us to where we are. And that can sound really conspiratorial, but I always bring it back to the contract. If you're a government agency, little things like, are you translating your forms? Are you purposefully seeking out organizations that have relationships with the people that you want to help? And then are you measuring over time whether or not people not only stay in their houses, but I think the cutting edge of our work, as I think it was the mayor that said this before, human dignity is actually on some level the goal here. I'm not sure who's found out the right way to measure that, but that to me is one of our cutting edge questions: is how do you measure the experience of a person's dignity and then build programs that can build that over the long term?
And I'm going to ask Gustavo in a second to give us a sort of a reflection on the way that states can work more closely and better with local communities and with the federal government. But first, Mayor, I know you wanted to follow up.
Yes, and I appreciate Leo, bringing that point back around. I think, in large part, historically we have looked at the measure of success within our efforts in cities based on things like GDP, our ability from the city standpoint, our ability to build new edifice, and all of those things. And I think that it should really be measured by sustainable development goals. What is the quality of our housing? What is the access to fresh fruit and vegetables? What is the sustainability of our infrastructure? Those are the things that we should measure in bringing into fruition this notion of a dignity economy. And far too often, we're measuring our success and failure on metrics that really do not get to the crux of where people are most harmed. And so those sustainable development goals have to be what we observe most diligently in our evaluation.
Thank you for that. Gustavo, you're there in Sacramento. Of course, California, just off the top of my head, I would think was the largest recipient in terms of state dollars for some of these programs, if not all of them. You have billions of dollars flowing into communities big and small there that run the gamut from very wealthy to very impoverished. In terms of what you see from the state relationship with local communities, just give us a sense of the role that states can better play in making sure that local communities are empowered to equitably distribute their resources.
Thank you for that question, Secretary. Has to be a very close coordination, right? Often some of the large local jurisdictions, LA, San Francisco, large cities, large counties can obtain federal resources directly, but the State Department of Housing, State Department of Health usually is the conduit. They are the conduit for federal resources into local communities. So the coordination has to be very well crafted and managed. In fact, Leo pointed out the rental assistance program is so important, the prevention of evictions in the midst of COVID. We knew the CDC eviction protections would probably end sooner than anything that the states themselves could prevent. So we acted quickly to establish one of the strongest eviction protections, but we were also the recipient of more than $5 billion of the $45 billion appropriated in Congress for rental relief. In California, we covered 100% of rent and utility debt that could not be paid by low-income households due to loss of income or loss of jobs during COVID. And it was, it was great coordination with the local levels. First to craft the guidelines of the program, focused on low income. Immediately we used data by census tract to pin down where the eviction risk was highest and target those resources. So of course there was a lot of complaining about, well, why is my jurisdiction getting less? What is getting more? It's always that kind of turf fight between local jurisdictions around dollars, especially federal dollars that the state is handling. But we knew where the highest evictions risks were, obviously all tied to low income and obviously, unfortunately, tied to people of color and minorities. And the program has been all the things that Leo talked about, language access and the ability to get to community outreach with, partnering with over 200 local organizations to get to those that needed most assistance. We've spared of eviction more than 230,000 households, run out of money, run out of $5 billion. But it had to be very, very closely coordinated with local. Now that's on the issue of keeping people housed. Now on the issue of producing more housing to ameliorate the crisis of affordability that I mentioned earlier, which is really about the state providing investments and a policy landscape that enables local jurisdictions to approve housing. Remember, the creation of housing, those approvals remain in local control. Well, we have something, Secretary, that you probably remember well, affirmatively further fair housing, when you spoke about that as the unfinished business of the 1968 Fair Housing Act to reverse, dismantle patterns of segregation and use a federal rule to create the incentives, but also the enforcement, more importantly, to ensure that local jurisdictions would do more to create housing choice. Housing choice open up places of high opportunity to more housing mobility strategies, but also invest more in place-based strategies that had the purpose of creating more choice and more integration in those communities. So when that rule in 2015 was enacted, signed by you, California Act quickly created its own, basically a replica of the 2015 federal rule codified into state law. It's called AB 686, the state statute, to create the same momentum under the same principles of the Obama era rule, to make sure that the state would oversee local jurisdictions' housing plans, every single housing plan of every city and every county in California, to do exactly what the 2015 rule intended to do. In fact, when Trump came into office, one of the great things is a lot of jurisdictions he's pushed back against the state because the federal rule was put on hold. But see, we had the state law already codified as a replication of the 2015 federal rule. And so we continue to do to ensure that every jurisdiction was creating their fair share of housing, but was doing it in a way that would further fair housing. And that's still ongoing. A lot of challenges in maybe 1/4 of the local jurisdictions to have those jurisdictions get to comply with that state law. But the fact of the matter is that's another example of how the state and local jurisdictions have to, establish guidelines, parameters to dismantle segregation, ensure that people of color, racial minorities, ethnic minorities have the housing in the right places, conducive to inclusive communities, integrated communities. And even though there's a lot of pushback, we are working with them. Some jurisdictions are going far along more than others, but every single jurisdiction has to comply with this affirmatively furthering fair housing state law. And that's another example of the working relationship and the patience in that working relationship to ensure that every jurisdiction gets to desegregate their communities as part of a state-local relationship.
Well, thank you for that insight. Mayor, you're in a totally different situation. You are in Mississippi. Jackson is the largest city in Mississippi. It's fair to say you have a different ideological perspective than state leadership. What is your advice for communities in my home state of Texas, in your state of Mississippi, or other places that find themselves in this very common situation, especially at a time, frankly, where state legislatures have put a target on the back, especially in bigger cities? You've been at it for 5 years. You have led during this pandemic, are leading now during this era of federal investment. Walk us through how you deal with that situation and what others should know.
Well, I'll begin just by acknowledging that, in Mississippi, whether people found favor with Donald Trump or Barack Obama before him and now President Biden, what I share with people is, when they ask me how I felt after the election of Donald Trump, I shared with them that I felt like that Tuesday or the Wednesday after he was elected, that I woke up in Mississippi. And what that means is that if we were poor before Donald Trump, we were likely poor after him. And for all of the federal leadership, the presidential leadership that I mentioned, that has still remained the case. And so, I think that we have to be targeted and intentional when we pass this legislation. I think that it is certainly commendable that we're seeing these federal funds coming, and we have to be encouraging about that. But it's not enough just to send these federal funds without the recognition that the Mississippis, the Texas, the Alabamas do truly exist, and the efforts of preemption are real. And so, I kind of alluded to it at the top of our discussion when I talked about, how, in this latest allocation, having spoken with the Administrator Regan of the EPA and even former Mayor Mitch Landrieu, the czar of the infrastructure bill, and looking at the state utilization plans and really maintaining and retaining some of the power over the allocation of these resources to states, because if that does not happen, then they will continue to leave us out of the equation. They will continue not to invite us to the table, and if you're not at the table, you're likely on the menu. What we face in Jackson, and I think that it does us no good not to bear out the facts and just be honest. As President Obama once said, the greatest form of patriotism is the recognition that America is not yet done. And so we have to expose these things. I'm having conversations for years, in fact, concerning the state of our water distribution system. And the fact that what our engineers have shared with us for years is that it is not a matter of if these systems will fail, but when these systems will fail. And that has manifested itself. And so when I'm having these conversations about the need for state investment, the need for the federal resources to be distributed to cities like Jackson in the state of Mississippi, I am confronted with the notion of, well, if you give up your airport, then maybe we can have a conversation, as if it should be, this compromise about how we relinquish a resource that is beneficial and useful and necessary to our city in order to receive the resources that should be equitably and commensurately provided to our city, or even the notion, and I want to head this off, even the notion that if you have these challenges, maybe we should regionalize your water system. Which is a farce. It's less a discussion about how you support the systems that are in need of support, and more a discussion about how you benefit from the revenue obtained from these systems to once again further exacerbate the problems that we've already seen.
Thank you. I think that resonates with a lot of local elected officials and advocates who find themselves in a similar situation. I want to ask one final question of each of the panelists, and I'll start with you, Cristania, because you have the opportunity to work with folks from different communities who come at participatory budgeting, I'm sure, with a lot of enthusiasm and hope that it's going to produce a different outcome in terms of the equitable distribution of resources. Let's say there's somebody out there, a council member, a county council member, somebody on the board of supervisors or a county executive who is feeling like they want to change the way that things are being done, that budgeting is being done. They want to get to those most vulnerable communities. They want to get to the neglected neighborhoods. What is your advice for them? And feel free to include, any nod toward resources that they would find helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things come to mind. And I will say the thing that we hear a lot, I think across the board, is if this is something you're interested in, be willing to take some risks. Be willing to recognize that your community members are taking risks all the time to advocate for their needs. Institutions need to be taking risks as well, particularly when we have like the padding and the clout and the infrastructure sort of that's more well established. We have to be willing to leverage that to really try things differently. Another piece within that, I think, is if you want to pursue some kind of participatory practice, be specific in your vision for that work. I think it relates a little bit to the previous question around, are we advocating for participatory budgeting for the sake of having participatory budgeting? Or are we really advocating because this is specifically intended to meet a very particular need? that's rooted in equity, that will guide a bit of how we outreach and do this work. There's so much caution around seeing this work co-opted and using the kind of phrasing of participatory democracy, participatory practice, without really backing it up with actions. Let's be specific, let's be intentional. Absolutely interrogate how institutional barriers can undermine the efficacy, the impacts of work like this, and really think about how it can undermine community trust, engagement, collaboration, and really consider, as you maybe move some work like this forward, yes, we'll engage community, but will we pay them? Because we should. We definitely should. Are we going to give up power? Are we willing to define the focus of our budget policies or budget initiatives in a way that's centered around those who are most impacted by those decisions, and working with community leaders to define those terms and define what equity really is and what that looks like. So be willing to do the work, I think, to build that trust and that understanding ahead of time. And make sure community wants it too. we are participatory sort of democracy and practice advocates. We believe that it works and it's important. But if there's no co-ownership with community and if folks don't want it, there's going to have to be work to kind of get there as well. And finally, I guess our biggest takeaway is do things like participatory budgeting, do things that include participatory practice. Again, not just when we have surplus of funds or flexible funds, integrate it into how you look at investments long-term in all areas where you can and are willing to invite community expertise and leadership into your work as a way that you do business. So some things that can really help, we have a myriad of resources on our website, participatorybudgeting.org. But a couple of things, we have a video that's actually centered on electeds who talk about why they, from their perspective, have tried participatory budgeting, why they continue to do it. And I mentioned previously, we have a coalition that we support called Democracy Beyond Elections, democracybeyondelections.org/resources. Tons of incredible toolkits that look at both participatory budgeting, but also policy making and actual toolkits and resources to help folks think about how to specifically apply participatory budgeting to American Rescue Plan Act funds and other kinds of federal funds. And also lists of coalition members who'd be really interested, I think, to support and share their experience about doing this advocacy and doing this work with each other, as well as within their specific communities as well.
Thank you. Leo, same question. Advice from your perspective for an elected advocate or a staff member. You see this from behind the scenes, who's interested in going down this path of doing things the right way, doing things better for the most underprivileged.
Absolutely. So one thing I do think that courage is important in this work, because the system and its current trajectory in which we exist now will not change course without bravery from people who are in charge of the system and the bravery of the people who are subjected to the system. So in addition to courage and bravery, I do also think that this notion that we talked about at the outset of symbiosis, I think sometimes leaders get it wrong, at least in this day and age, when they begin to think that it is their job to do something by themselves. Leaders should have a productive connection to the communities that they serve. Again, I'll just offer, I don't think that's actually a controversial notion. I just think who we include in those relationships can sometimes feel controversial. Asking seniors what we ought to do with funding for seniors doesn't seem super controversial, but for some reason asking a person who's experiencing homelessness what we ought to do with funding that would benefit a person experiencing homelessness feels more controversial. I think that's more about our assumptions about the people than the actual process. And then I think the final thing that I'd offer is that we can't overlook, in the sort of grand sweep of vision and courage, the importance of these small things that are actually the workings of government. And I keep talking about contracts, procurement processes. It is these mechanisms of government that some people will call bureaucracy, that can just as easily yield durable, equitable results as they can yield inequitable results And that is all in how you write, craft, implement, and then expose those mechanisms to the community. And so we've got on this panel a lot of, I think, really visionary, deeply steeped leaders who are responsible for a lot. And that's essential. That courage is essential. That community connection, that symbiosis is essential. But I'll contend that you also need contract monitors who feel empowered to do something as simple but powerful as writing that the purpose of this request for proposal is to fund organizations in a way that will reduce the impact of racism in the experience of homelessness in King County, Washington. And what I found is when you have contract monitors who begin to feel that confidence that you as an organization will support them, they'll do some pretty amazing things.
All right, thank you so much, Leo. Gustavo, we'll go over to you. Advice for policymakers, advocates, staffers out there that are intrigued by this conversation and want to go forward with doing things differently.
Continue to engage and provide us advice. We always have to use at the state level the carrots and sticks approach. We have a unique program called a pro-housing designation program that allows localities to access directly state funding for housing and community development if they meet a threshold of pro-housing. And that basically boils down to changes in land use and zoning with a fair housing lens to allow more creation of affordable housing. Use of, plans to meet both equity goals, affordable housing goals, and climate goals all together. And we are working with local advocacy groups for them to work with local jurisdictions to make these changes in their local rules, zoning rules, and other land use norms that they have in their localities. But we are not shying away from using the authority of the state law to also enforce if local jurisdictions aren't creating their fair share and they're creating it with an equitable lens. In fact, when Governor Newsom came into office, one of the first things he did was to approve a lawsuit against a community, very affluent coastal community. You may have heard of it, Huntington Beach. Have a lot of these very affluent communities, coastal communities, these very small communities that for decades have, it's been really hard to see the creation of more affordable housing in those communities. And so I'll tell you what, one of my best allies right now, who I respect tremendously, is the Attorney General of the state, because we have teamed up. He's created his own Attorney General Bonta Strike Force housing team, group of attorneys working with our attorneys in the housing department to ensure that if, for example, localities are not using government-owned land to first go and seek bids for the creation of a affordable and homeless housing before they use the land to build a stadium or build something else, that is a prohibition of the state law, and we have to team up with the Attorney General to ensure that those laws happen. Is that actually happening right now as we speak with the Anaheim Stadium in Anaheim? So I just want to say there's a lot of carrots and sticks. We always going to take the approach of working with localities first, providing that consultation, technical assistance, education of what is it exactly that they need to do to achieve these equitable outcomes, work with a number of stakeholders, advocacy groups to stay engaged. And, we have mixed results as of right now, but we just issued a statewide housing action plan 3 weeks ago that calls for the creation of 2.5 million new homes between now and year 2030. And all of these policies that the state for the last 2 years, the state legislature has enacted into law are going to help tremendously to achieve that goal of 2.5 million homes. And we cannot take hands off, just we always going to be collaboratively with local jurisdictions. That we prefer that way. We obviously, that is our vision and to commitment to working collaboratively with local jurisdictions. But there's a part here of enforcement that has to be talked about, because if it has to be used, it will be used.
Great. And Mayor, same question, advice for others who are interested in pursuing making these investments equitably.
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to incorporate all of the previous remarks of my co-panelists. I agree wholeheartedly with what has been expressed today. But I would just share this, and I think this gets to the core of our discussion. I think that as we govern, as we create policy, whether we're in government or working through community, we have to do so with a guiding set of principles. And the principle that I govern with, the principle by which I try to utilize in my life is the principle of self-determination. I come from a background of organizers. My family, my parents thought that it was not only important to give me food, water, and shelter, but a sense of community and the understanding of the value of community, the value of the family, and more important than that, the value of viewing the community as a family. And so, when I look at some of the things that mayors are primarily tasked with dealing with, things like infrastructure, coming out of that space, people have challenged me. How are you going to truly reveal an equitable world? How are you going to fight oppression by fixing a pothole? And so the analysis that I have come to is that, quite honestly, that has to be our mission. How do we connect pothole to pothole and community to community? So people in Jackson, Mississippi understand that there's a community that looks just like theirs in San Antonio, Texas, in Los Angeles, California, in Gary, Indiana, in New Orleans, Louisiana. And in that process of fixing that pothole, what we ultimately realize is that the pothole was never our problem in the first place. Our problem is that we don't control the decision-making process that leads to a pothole being fixed, that we have very little say-so over the economic development that takes place in our community. We have little impact on the curriculum that educates our children. And so our problem is a fundamental one, is that we lack the self-determination to dictate the quality of life that people so justly deserve. And so what our mission has to be is to democratize power. And I think that if we combine everything that has been stated here, not only having a proper framework of what we should value, but the process of including people's voice in that decision-making, then I think we have the foundation of what it takes to start looking at building a society beyond contradiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I like that, democratizing power. There's quite an opportunity to do that in communities all over our country. So I wanted to say a huge thank you to each of our panelists for sharing your insights today, to Cristania, to Leo, to Gustavo, and to Mayor Lumumba. Thank you for all of the great work that y'all are undertaking now in your roles. And to each and every one of the folks watching today, I hope that this has spurred some great thinking about in this moment, in this once in a generation opportunity that local communities have to pivot, to right some of the wrongs of the past, to do things indeed not only differently but better, that you will seize that opportunity. And hopefully you've heard some things today that have helped you to think about how you might do that. We'll also make sure to include a link to some of the resources that were mentioned by our panelists today for those who are interested in getting started and finding out more information. And with that, again, thank you all so much for sharing your insights. Until next time, thank you for joining us.